Elara didn't know that the hooded figure standing at the edge of the crowd was the most powerful alpha in all the 7 realms. She didn't know that his hands had never trembled, not once in 3 centuries of rule. And she certainly didn't know that the moment she knelt at the executioner's block, those same steady hands clenched into fists that could crush mountains. The rough wood bit into her knees through the thin fabric of her execution dress. White they'd made her wear. Pure white, like she was some virgin sacrifice instead of a condemned thief. The irony would have made her laugh if terror hadn't stolen her voice 3 days ago. The crowd pressed closer, their excitement a living thing that made her skin crawl. She could smell their anticipation, sour and eager. They'd come to see justice served. They'd come to watch Elara Blackwood die for crimes she'd never committed. "Read the charges," commanded Lord Aldrich, her stepfather's voice carrying across the courtyard like the crack of a whip. The herald unrolled his parchment with ceremonial flourish. Elara Blackwood stands accused of treason against the crown, theft of royal artifacts, and practicing forbidden magic within the sacred boundaries of Ravenshollow. Each word hit her like a physical blow. Treason! The emerald necklace they'd planted in her chamber. The scrying bowl her stepmother had placed beneath her bed while she slept. "Have you any final words?" The executioner's voice was muffled behind his black mask, but she caught the note of reluctance. Even he knew this was wrong. Elara lifted her chin, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I am innocent of these charges. My blood will cry out for justice long after you've silenced my voice." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. Good. Let them remember this moment when the truth finally came to light. The executioner hefted his axe, the steel gleaming in the afternoon sun. Such a massive thing. She wondered if she would feel it, or if death would be swift enough to spare her that final agony. Her stepmother stood in the front row, satisfaction gleaming in her cold blue eyes. Beside her, Elara's stepsister Morgana wore black silk like she was already in mourning. But her smile gave her away. They'd finally succeeded in removing the unwanted burden from their perfect family. "You should have accepted the marriage proposal to Lord Garrett," Morgana had whispered 3 nights ago as the guards dragged Elara to the dungeons. "Should have taken the gold and disappeared like a good little bastard." But Elara had refused. She wouldn't be sold to a cruel man twice her age just to line her stepmother's pockets. She'd rather die free than live as property. Apparently, she was about to get that chance. The executioner raised the axe above his head. Time slowed to honey-thick moments. Elara closed her eyes and thought of her mother, dead these 10 years. Soon they would be together again. Soon this nightmare would end. She thought of all the things she'd never do. Never feel a kind hand stroke her hair. Never know what it meant to be chosen, treasured, loved. Never birth children who would know safety in her arms. Never. "Stop!" The word cut through the silence like lightning splitting the sky. Elara's eyes snapped open. The executioner had frozen mid-swing, his massive frame trembling. The crowd turned as one toward the voice, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind before a storm. A figure emerged from the masses. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. His hood fell back as he walked, revealing dark hair and features carved from stone and shadow. But it was his eyes that made the crowd step back, that made seasoned warriors drop their gazes to the ground, golden, ancient, utterly without mercy. "I said stop." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of power that bent kingdoms to its will. The executioner's axe clattered to the platform. "Your Majesty," he whispered, falling to his knees. "Forgive me, I didn't know." "She dies," the stranger continued, his gaze never leaving Elara's face. "You all die." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dragon's breath. Impossible, devastating, absolute. Lord Aldrich pushed forward, his face purple with rage and confusion. "Your Majesty, there must be some mistake. This girl is a convicted criminal, sentenced by proper trial." Those golden eyes shifted to him for just a moment, just long enough to make the Lord stumble backward and fall silent. "There is no mistake." The Alpha King stepped onto the platform, his presence filling the space like gathering storm clouds. "Release her, now." Power rolled off him in waves that made Ilara's knees weak. Every wolf in the crowd felt it, that crushing weight of an alpha so pure, so ancient, that resistance became impossible. One by one, they knelt. Guards, nobles, commoners, even Lord Aldrich dropped to the cobblestones. Everyone except Ilara. She remained frozen on her knees, staring up at this impossible man who had just threatened an entire city for her life. Heat bloomed in her chest, spreading outward like wine spilled into water. Something golden and molten unfurled behind her ribs, reaching toward him with desperate recognition. The Alpha King knelt beside her, his large hands working at the rough rope binding her wrists. His touch sent electricity racing up her arms, and she gasped at the intensity of it. "Look at me," he murmured, his voice suddenly gentle as rainfall. She obeyed without thought, meeting those devastating golden eyes. Up close, she could see flecks of amber and bronze, like molten metal cooled to perfect beauty. This close, she could smell him, cedar and winter air and something wild that made her wolf whimper with longing. "What's your name?" he asked, still working at her bonds. "Ilara." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Ilara Blackwood." A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his harsh features into something breathtaking. "I'm Kieran, and you, Ilara Blackwood, are coming with me." The ropes fell away. Blood rushed back into her hands, bringing pins and needles that made her fingers twitch, but she barely noticed. The golden warmth in her chest had spread everywhere, filling hollow spaces she hadn't known existed. "I don't understand," she breathed. He stood, offering her his hand. "You will." Something in his voice, some note of certainty and promise, made her believe him. Made her place her trembling fingers in his strong, steady grip. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Heat and light and rightness so pure it brought tears to her eyes. The bond snapped into place like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life. "Mine," something inside her whispered. "Mine, mine, mine." His eyes widened slightly, and she knew he felt it too. This impossible, overwhelming sense of completion. "Impossible!" Lord Aldrich sputtered from his position on the ground. "She's nobody, a bastard, a thief. Surely your Majesty doesn't mean to—" "I mean," Kieran said, without taking his eyes off Ilara, "to take what belongs to me." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, sending fresh sparks up her arm. "What has always belonged to me." He helped her to her feet, his other hand coming to rest at the small of her back. Protective, possessive, steadying. "Your Majesty?" Her stepmother's voice cut through the stunned silence, syrup-sweet and calculating. "Perhaps we could discuss terms. The girl has value, certainly, but her family should be compensated for—" Kieran's head turned toward her with predatory slowness. When he spoke, ice crystallized in the air between them. "Her family!" The words dripped with contempt. "You mean the people who framed an innocent girl for treason? Who were prepared to watch her die for gold?" Lady Vivienne's face went white. Beside her, Morgana had begun to tremble. "Your Majesty, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding—" "The only misunderstanding," Kieran interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard, "is the belief that you could touch what's mine and live to speak of it." The threat in his words made grown men whimper, but Ilara felt no fear, only wonder at the fierce protectiveness in his voice, the way he spoke of her like she mattered, like she was precious. "Come," he murmured, his tone gentling again as he turned back to her. "Let's go home." Home! The word hit her like a physical caress. She'd never had a real home, never had anyone fight for her, protect her, claim her as theirs. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Whatever this was, wherever this impossible man wanted to take her, it had to be better than the life she was leaving behind. As they walked through the crowd, people scrambled to get out of their way. Ilara kept her eyes forward, her hand still clasped in Kieran's strong grip. She didn't look back at her stepfamily, or the execution block, or the life that had nearly ended before it truly began. Behind them, the crowd remained on their knees until long after the Alpha King and his mate had disappeared from sight. The knife sliced through her bonds with surgical precision. Kieran's hands were steady where hers trembled, his fingers brushing against her wrists as he freed her from the executioner's ropes. Each touch sent that impossible warmth racing through her veins, making her breath catch. "Easy," he murmured, as if gentling a wild creature. "You're safe now." Safe! The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Ilara watched in stunned silence as the crowd remained on their knees, not daring to rise while their Alpha King stood before them. The power radiating from him was overwhelming, ancient and absolute. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich ventured again, his voice cracking like old parchment. "Surely there are protocols to follow. The girl was properly tried and convicted." "By whose authority?" Kieran's voice cut through the air like winter wind. He didn't turn away from Ilara, but his words carried enough ice to freeze blood. "Mine? I don't recall authorizing the execution of my mate." Mate! The word hit the crowd like a physical blow. Gasps echoed across the courtyard, followed by whispered prayers and curses. Ilara's stepmother looked ready to faint. "Impossible," Lady Vivian whispered. "She's nobody, a servant's bastard daughter. She can't be—" Kieran's head turned toward her with predatory grace. When he spoke, his voice held the promise of violence. "Speak of her again, and I will forget that execution is too merciful for your crimes." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Lady Vivian's mouth snapped shut, her face draining of all colour. "Come," Kieran said, his tone gentling again as he turned back to Ilara. "Let's leave this place." He offered her his arm like she was nobility instead of a condemned prisoner. The gesture was so unexpected, so impossibly courteous, that tears pricked at her eyes. When had anyone ever treated her with such care? Her step-family watched in horrified fascination as she placed her hand on his forearm. The fabric of his sleeve was soft beneath her fingers, finer than anything she'd ever touched. Rich midnight blue with silver threading that caught the light. This close, she could see the embroidered wolves running along the cuffs, so detailed they seemed ready to leap from the fabric. They walked through the parting crowd in silence, people stumbling over themselves to get out of their way. Ilara kept her eyes forward, trying to process what had just happened. An hour ago, she'd been preparing to die. Now she was walking beside the most powerful man in the 7 realms, and he'd called her his mate. His horse waited at the courtyard's edge, a magnificent black stallion that stood perfectly still despite the chaos around them. The animal was enormous, easily 17 hands high, with eyes that held the same ancient intelligence as his master's. "This is Shadow," Kieran said, running a hand along the horse's neck. "He's been with me for nearly a century." A century, right. Alpha Kings lived for hundreds of years, growing stronger with age instead of weaker. What did that make her to him? A brief flicker in his long existence. As if reading her thoughts, Kieran's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Don't," he said softly. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." "You don't know what I'm thinking." A smile ghosted across his lips. "You're wondering if this is real? Wondering if you matter to someone like me?" His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "You do. More than you could possibly imagine." The certainty in his voice made her chest tight. How could he be so sure when they'd just met? How could he look at her like she was precious when everyone else had always seen her as worthless? Kieran mounted Shadow with fluid grace, then reached down for her. Trust me. Trust, another foreign concept, but something about the patient way he waited, hand extended, made her want to try. She placed her fingers in his and let him pull her up behind him. The horse was warm and solid beneath her, and Kieran's back was a wall of strength against her chest. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to stay seated, bringing her into intimate contact with him. The scent of him surrounded her, cedar and winter air, and something wild that made her wolf whimper with longing. "Where are we going?" she asked as Shadow began moving through the city streets. "Home," he said simply. They rode in comfortable silence through the winding cobblestone streets. Ilara had lived in Ravenshollow her entire life, but she'd never seen it from this perspective. People lined the streets to watch their Alpha King pass, bowing deeply as Shadow's hooves rang against the stones. She caught glimpses of their faces: awe, fear, curiosity. Some stared at her with undisguised shock, the nobody riding behind their legendary king. "They're staring," she murmured against his shoulder. "Let them stare," he replied without concern. "They'll need to get used to seeing you beside me." Beside him, like an equal. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The city gave way to open countryside, rolling hills covered in autumn grass that waved like golden silk in the afternoon breeze. In the distance, mountains rose toward the sky, their peaks crowned with snow even in the mild weather. "Tell me about yourself," Kieran said as Shadow settled into an easy canter. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with how you ended up on that execution block." The old pain rose in her throat like bile. "My step-family needed me gone. I refused to marry the man they'd chosen for me, so they framed me for crimes I didn't commit." "The marriage proposal," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Tell me about that." "Lord Garrett of Blackmere, 60 years old, 3 dead wives, and a reputation for cruelty. My stepmother negotiated a bride price that would have cleared their debts." She shuddered at the memory of Garrett's leering smile, his hands that lingered too long when he'd come to inspect his potential purchase. "I told them I'd rather die than marry him." "You nearly got your wish." The words came out rougher than she expected, edged with fury that wasn't directed at her. "I meant it. I won't be sold like livestock." "No," he agreed quietly, "you won't." They crested a hill, and Ilara's breath caught. Spread out below them was a valley unlike anything she'd ever seen. Ancient trees rose like cathedral spires, their leaves turned brilliant gold and crimson by autumn's touch. A river wound through the centre like a silver ribbon, and beside it— "Gods above," she whispered. The castle was carved from the mountain itself, its towers rising into the clouds like something from a fairy tale. It was massive beyond comprehension, beautiful and terrible and utterly imposing. This wasn't just a stronghold. This was the seat of ultimate power. "Welcome to Shadowmere," Kieran said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "My home, your home now." Her home. The words sent a flutter of panic through her chest. "I don't belong in a place like that." "You belong wherever I am," he said, with such simple certainty that it stole her breath. "And I belong here, therefore, so do you." The logic was flawed, surely, but something about the way he said it, the absolute conviction in his voice, made her want to believe him. As they descended into the valley, she noticed details that spoke of incredible wealth and power. The road was paved with smooth stones that never seemed to show wear. Gardens spread out in carefully tended splendour, filled with flowers she'd never seen before. Servants moved about their tasks with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, but they paused to bow as their king passed. "How many people live here?" she asked. "In the castle itself, perhaps 200. In the valley, nearly 3,000. They're all under my protection now, as are you." Protection. Another word that felt foreign. She'd spent so long looking after herself, surviving on scraps and stubbornness, that the idea of someone else shouldering that burden seemed impossible. The castle gates opened at their approach, massive oak doors reinforced with iron bands. Guards lined the entrance, each one dropping to one knee as Shadow clattered into the courtyard. "Your Majesty," an older man stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming in the late afternoon sun. He wore rich burgundy robes that marked him as someone of importance. "We weren't expecting your return so soon." "Plans changed, Marcus." Kieran dismounted with easy grace, then reached up to help Ilara down. His hands spanned her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. "This is Ilara, my mate." The word rang out across the courtyard like a bell. Every person within hearing distance went perfectly still, their eyes wide with shock and something that might have been joy. Marcus recovered first, dropping into a deep bow. "My lady, welcome to Shadowmere." My lady, not the bastard or the burden or any of the other names she'd grown up hearing. Just my lady, spoken with genuine respect. She started, then stopped. What did one say to such courtesy? She'd never been taught the proper responses for situations like this. "She's had a difficult day," Kieran said smoothly, his hand finding the small of her back. "Perhaps we could continue the introductions after she's had time to rest." "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll have the Queen's chambers prepared immediately." The Queen's chambers. Ilara's knees went weak. She gripped Kieran's arm without thinking, needing the solid strength of him to keep from falling. "Easy," he murmured, the word meant only for her ears. One step at a time. One step at a time. She could manage that. She'd been taking one step at a time her entire life, surviving moment by moment when the future seemed impossible. This was just another impossible moment to navigate. But as Kieran led her through doors that were taller than trees, past tapestries that depicted the history of his lineage, she wondered if any amount of steps could bridge the gap between who she'd been this morning and who she apparently was now. The Alpha King's mate. The future queen of the 7 realms. The most terrifying titles she'd ever heard. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the soft knock of servants and the reality of where she was. Ilara woke in a bed larger than her childhood room, surrounded by silk hangings in deep emerald green. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked gardens so beautiful they made her chest ache. She'd barely managed 3 hours of sleep, startling awake every time she forgot where she was. The nightmares had been worse than usual, the executioner's axe falling again and again, only this time Kieran didn't arrive in time to stop it. Another knock, more insistent this time. "My lady, come in," she called, her voice hoarse from screaming in her sleep. A young woman entered carrying a breakfast tray, her movements graceful and efficient. She wore the deep blue livery of Shadowmere's household staff, her blonde hair neatly braided back from a kind face. "Good morning, my lady. I'm Sarah, your lady's maid. His Majesty asked me to see to your needs." She set the tray on the small table by the window, then turned with a warm smile. "He also said you might prefer to break your fast in your chambers this morning, rather than in the great hall." Ilara's cheeks burned. Of course he'd noticed her terror yesterday, the way she'd gripped his arm like a lifeline as they'd walked through his castle. The thought of facing a hall full of nobles and courtiers made her stomach clench. "That's very thoughtful of him," she managed. "His Majesty is always considerate of others' comfort," Sarah said, and there was genuine fondness in her voice. "He's requested that you join him in his study when you're ready. No rush, though. He said to tell you he'll wait as long as you need." As long as you need. The words echoed something he'd said yesterday, some promise about patience that had made her chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. The breakfast was a feast compared to what she was used to. Fresh bread with honey butter, eggs cooked to perfection, fruit so ripe it practically burst with sweetness. There was enough food for 3 people, as if they weren't sure what she might prefer. She ate slowly, savouring each bite while gazing out at the gardens. Servants moved among the flower beds with careful attention, tending to plants she'd never seen before. Everything here was beautiful, well cared for, loved, so different from the cold neglect of her step-family's house. When she finally made her way to Kieran's study, she found him standing before a massive window that overlooked the valley. Morning light caught the bronze highlights in his dark hair, and she had to pause in the doorway just to look at him. He was still the most beautiful man she'd ever seen, powerful and elegant in equal measure. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "Did you sleep well?" The polite lie died on her lips. Something about his tone, gentle and without judgment, made honesty feel safe. "No, I kept dreaming about yesterday." He turned then, and she caught the flash of pain in his golden eyes before he carefully schooled his features. "I should have expected that, I'm sorry." "Why are you apologizing? You saved my life." "I was almost too late." His hands clenched at his sides. "If I hadn't felt your terror through the bond, hadn't followed that pull to Ravenshollow." "But you did," she said quickly. "You came. No one has ever done that for me before." Something shifted in his expression, a softness that transformed his harsh features into something breathtaking. "No one has ever protected you before." It wasn't a question. He said it like he already knew the answer, and the certainty in his voice made her throat tight. "I learned to protect myself," she said, lifting her chin with pride she wasn't sure she felt. "You shouldn't have had to." The words came out rougher than silk, edged with fury that wasn't directed at her. "Tell me about your family, your real family." She moved to the chair he gestured toward, grateful for the chance to sit. Her legs still felt unsteady whenever he looked at her like that, like she was something precious he'd been searching for his whole life. "My mother was a healer," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She worked for Lord Blackwood's household, caring for the family and staff. When she became pregnant with me, he claimed responsibility but never acknowledged me publicly." Kieran settled into the chair across from her, close enough that she could smell that intoxicating scent of cedar and winter air. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her when I was 8. After that, Lord Blackwood married Lady Vivian. She tolerated my presence because she had to, but made it clear I was a burden. When he died 3 years ago, she and Morgana saw their chance to be rid of me permanently." "They tried to sell you to Lord Garrett." The disgust in his voice made her look up in surprise. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's been petitioning for an audience with me for months, trying to negotiate some trade agreement." Kieran's eyes went cold as winter storms. If I'd known he was planning to force a young woman into marriage, that audience would have ended very differently. The protective fury in his voice sent warmth spiralling through her chest. When had anyone ever been angry on her behalf? When had anyone ever considered her worth defending? "I've been taking care of myself for a long time," she said quietly. "I'm not used to having someone else worry about me." "Get used to it." The words were gentle but implacable. "You're mine now. That means your safety, your happiness, your well-being, all of it matters to me, more than my own." More than his own, the Alpha King of the 7 realms, saying her happiness mattered more than his. It was impossible to believe, and yet the sincerity in his voice made her want to try. "I don't understand this," she admitted, gesturing between them. "This bond, this mate thing, I've never even shifted. My wolf has always been quiet." "Mine wasn't." A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his severe features. "The moment I scented you yesterday, he went wild. 3 centuries of waiting, and then there you were." 3 centuries. The number hit her like a physical blow. "You've been alive for 300 years. Give or take a decade. I'm 19. "I know." His hand reached across the space between them, covering hers where it rested on the chair arm. "Does that frighten you?" It should have. The age difference was vast beyond comprehension. But when he touched her, when that golden warmth spread up her arm and settled behind her ribs like a second heartbeat, fear seemed impossible. "Everything about this frightens me," she said honestly, "but not in the way it should." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Tell me what frightens you." "That this isn't real, that I'll wake up and find myself back in that dungeon, waiting to die." She took a shaky breath. "That someone like you could never really want someone like me." "Someone like me?" His thumb brushed across her knuckles, sending sparks racing up her arm. "You mean someone who spent 3 centuries alone? Someone who'd given up hope of ever finding his other half? Someone who's ruled through duty and necessity but never joy? Someone powerful, important, someone who could have anyone. I don't want anyone." His golden eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. "I want you, only you. I've wanted you since before I knew you existed, waiting for the sound of your voice, the touch of your hand, the way you look at me like I'm more than just a crown and a title." The words hit her like arrows, each one finding its mark in the hollow spaces of her heart. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was wanted for herself rather than what she could provide. "I don't know how to be what you need," she whispered. "You already are." He lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles that made her breath catch. "You're brave, brave enough to refuse a marriage that would have destroyed you, brave enough to face execution rather than surrender your freedom. You're kind. I saw the way you looked at the executioner yesterday, understanding his reluctance even in your fear. And you're mine." Mine. The possessiveness in the word should have alarmed her, but instead it sent a thrill through her that left her dizzy. "What about you?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "What was it like ruling alone for so long?" Something flickered in his expression, a vulnerability he quickly tried to hide. "Lonely," he admitted quietly. "I have advisors, allies, people who depend on me, but no one who truly knew me, no one I could be weak with." "You don't seem like you're ever weak." A bitter laugh escaped him. "I'm weak every moment I'm with you. One look from you and I'd burn down kingdoms. One tear and I'd move mountains to make you smile again." The words were so romantic, so impossibly devoted, that they made her chest ache. "That sounds terrifying, having that much power over someone." "It's terrifying being powerless for the first time in 3 centuries, he agreed. "But it's also the most alive I've ever felt." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, her small hand still clasped in his larger one. Outside the window, birds sang in the garden trees, their voices bright with morning joy. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you rest. You heal from what they did to you. You learn about this place, these people who are now yours to protect as much as they are mine." His thumb continued its gentle stroking across her skin. "You let me court you properly, the way you should have been courted years ago." "Court me?" Surprise coloured her voice. "But we're already mated." "The bond exists," he said carefully. "But you haven't chosen it yet. Not truly. You were too frightened yesterday, too overwhelmed to make a real decision. I won't claim you completely until you're ready, until you choose me as freely as I choose you." The generosity of it, the patience, made tears prick at her eyes. "Most alphas wouldn't wait." "I'm not most alphas." His voice held quiet certainty. "And you're not a prize to be won or a possession to be claimed. You're my equal, my other half, and you deserve to be wooed properly." Wooed, like she was worth the effort, worth the time and attention, like she mattered enough for the most powerful man in the known world to seek her favour. "I don't know the first thing about being courted," she admitted. "Then I'll teach you." He brought her hand to his lips again, pressing another soft kiss to her palm. "I'll teach you what it means to be treasured, cherished, loved the way you deserve." Loved. The word hung between them like a promise, fragile and precious and terrifying. She'd never been loved before, not truly. She wasn't sure she knew how to accept it, how to trust it. But looking into Kieran's golden eyes, seeing the patient devotion there, She thought she might like to learn. The days that followed were a whirlwind of careful courtship and growing trust. Kieran kept his promise, wooing her with a patience that took her breath away. He brought her books from his private library, shared quiet meals in his study, walked with her through gardens that bloomed impossibly even as autumn deepened. Elara found herself laughing more than she had in years. Kieran had a dry sense of humour hidden beneath his regal exterior, and he seemed to delight in coaxing smiles from her lips. When she argued with him about philosophy or challenged his opinions on literature, his eyes would light up with something like joy. "You're not what I expected," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire in his study, her feet curled beneath her in the oversized chair he'd claimed was hers now. "What did you expect?" He looked up from the document he'd been reviewing, giving her his full attention in that way that always made her feel precious. "Someone more imperial, demanding, cold." A smile ghosted across his lips. "I can be all of those things when necessary, but not with you. Never with you." It was in moments like these that she felt the bond between them singing, that golden thread growing stronger each day. She was beginning to trust it, to trust him, to believe that perhaps she truly could belong in this impossible life, which made the letter that arrived 3 days later all the more devastating. Marcus brought it to her himself, his usually composed features tight with concern. "My lady, this came through unconventional channels. His Majesty is in council, but I thought you should see it immediately." The parchment was expensive, cream-coloured with an elegant hand, but the words written upon it made her blood turn to ice. The false queen believes herself safe in her stolen palace. She believes her Alpha's power can protect her from the consequences of her presumption. She is wrong. Every moment she draws breath, she weakens the true king. Every day she remains, she hastens his downfall. The Shadow Court sees all. The Shadow Court remembers, and the Shadow Court will not suffer pretenders to live. You have one day to leave Shadowmere forever. If you remain, if you continue this charade of belonging where you do not belong, the consequences will fall not just on you, but on every soul who shelters you. Your death will be the first of many. Run, little rabbit, before we decide to hunt." The letter slipped from her nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. The Shadow Court. She'd heard whispers of them her entire life, stories told in hushed voices about wolves who had rejected the rule of the Alpha Kings, who plotted in darkness for a return to the old ways. "My lady," Marcus stepped forward, concern creasing his weathered features. "What is it?" But Elara couldn't speak. Terror had stolen her voice, just as it had 3 days before her execution. The old fears came rushing back, the certainty that she brought nothing but danger to anyone who cared for her, that her very existence was a curse. She snatched up the letter and fled. The gardens had become her refuge over the past week, the one place where she felt she could breathe freely. She ran to the furthest corner now, where ancient oak trees created a natural bower away from prying eyes. Her chest heaved as she tried to process what she'd read. The Shadow Court knew about her. They saw her as a threat, a weakness in Kieran's armour. And they were right, weren't they? She was nobody, a bastard servant's daughter playing at being queen. Her presence here put everyone at risk. "Elara?" She spun toward the familiar voice, finding Kieran approaching through the trees. His golden eyes immediately found the letter clutched in her trembling hands, and his expression darkened. "What is that?" His voice carried the edge of command now, the imperial tone he used in council. Wordlessly, she handed him the parchment. She watched his face as he read, saw the moment fury overtook concern. The air around him began to shimmer with barely leashed power. "When did this arrive?" The words came out dangerously soft. "Marcus brought it to me a few minutes ago. He said it came through unconventional channels." Kieran crushed the letter in his fist, the parchment crumbling like autumn leaves. "The Shadow Court." He spat the words like a curse. I should have expected this. You knew they might target me. I knew they would see our bond as an opportunity to strike. His eyes met hers, blazing with protective fury. I didn't expect them to be foolish enough to threaten you directly. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that had overtaken her entire body. They're right, though. I am your weakness now. I'm putting everyone here at risk. You are not! He cut himself off, visibly struggling for control. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. You are not a weakness. You're my strength. You're the reason I would burn the world to ash if necessary. The fierce devotion in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it only made her more afraid. Don't you see? That's exactly what they want. They want you distracted, compromised. They want to use me against you. Let them try. Kieran, no, listen to me. She stepped closer, reaching for his hands. I won't be the reason you fall. I won't be the weapon they use to destroy you. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding that made her stomach clench. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe they're right. Maybe I should go. The words hung between them like a blade. Kieran went perfectly still, his golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to take the words back. You want to leave. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the hurt beneath it. I want you to be safe. I want your people to be safe. Tears burned behind her eyes. I can't live with myself if something happens to you because of me. And I can't live at all without you. The simple honesty of it broke something loose in her chest. You've lived without me for 300 years. I survived, he corrected, stepping closer. I existed. I ruled and fought and endured, but I never lived. Not until the moment I saw you on that execution block and felt my world finally make sense. Kieran, no. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the fierce emotion in his eyes. Do you remember what I told you that first day? She dies, you all die. That wasn't just a threat, Ilara. It was a promise, a truth. If something happens to you, if you leave, if you run from this because you're afraid, there won't be anything left of me worth saving. Tears spilled down her cheeks now, hot and unstoppable. I can't be responsible for that kind of devotion. I don't know how to carry the weight of being that important to someone. You don't have to carry anything. His thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite tenderness. I carry you, remember? That's what mates do. That's what this bond means. We protect each other, support each other, face the world together. Together, she whispered, the word fragile as spun glass. Together, he confirmed. Let the Shadow Court come. Let them try to tear us apart. They'll discover that threatening what's mine is the fastest way to ensure their destruction. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, made her want to believe. But fear still clawed at her throat. What if they're too strong? What if there are too many of them? Then we'll face them anyway. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. I've spent 3 centuries learning to fight alone. I don't want to learn how to do it again. The admission cost him. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. This powerful ancient king acknowledging that he needed her, that he was stronger with her than without her. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. The confession surprised her. I'm terrified of losing you. I'm terrified of failing to protect you. I'm terrified that one day you'll realize you deserve better than a man who's forgotten how to be anything but a weapon. His hands tightened on her face. But I'd rather face all of that terror with you beside me than face a single day of safety without you. The words unlocked something deep in her chest, some tight knot of fear and unworthiness that had lived there for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. He wasn't asking her to be fearless. He was asking her to be afraid together. What do we do? She asked. Relief flickered across his features, quick and bright. We prepare. We make sure the Shadow Court understands that threatening you was the last mistake they'll ever make." His voice hardened to steel. "And we show them what happens when someone tries to separate true mates." Ilara nodded, trying to find her courage in the depths of his golden eyes. She was still terrified. The Shadow Court was ancient and powerful and utterly without mercy. But Kieran was right. She was stronger with him than without him. And if their enemies thought they could use her love for him as a weapon, they were about to discover their mistake. The Shadow Court had made one critical error. They'd threatened not just any alpha's mate, but the mate of the most powerful king in 7 realms. And they'd forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was give a man like Kieran Darkwood something worth dying for. Now they were about to learn what it meant to give him something worth killing for. 2 days later, the trap was sprung. Kieran had been preparing for war since the Shadow Court's threat arrived. Shadowmere's ancient walls hummed with protective magic, while his most trusted guards tripled their patrols. But when the formal summons came from the Grand Council, demanding his immediate presence for an emergency session, they both knew the real battle had begun. "It's a trap," Ilara said, pacing before the fire in his study. "They're forcing you to choose between your duty as Alpha King and staying here to protect me." "I know." Kieran's voice was grimly calm as he buckled on his ceremonial sword. "Which is why you're staying here, behind wards that have protected this castle for 1,000 years, with my most trusted guards." "What if that's not enough?" Fear made her voice thin. "What if they found a way through your defences?" He crossed to her in 3 swift strides, framing her face in his hands. "Then they'll discover that threatening you was the last mistake they'll ever make." His thumb traced her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I'll be back before sunset, I promise." She wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but she could see the weight of kingship in his eyes. The Grand Council commanded his presence, and he could not ignore that summons without civil war. "I'll be waiting," she whispered instead, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his lips. The kiss was gentle, careful, but she felt his restraint crack for just a moment. His arms tightened around her, and she tasted desperation beneath the tenderness. When they broke apart, his golden eyes were blazing. "Stay safe," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion. "That's an order from your king." "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, with a small smile that didn't quite hide her fear. He was gone within the hour, riding out with a full escort toward the ancient meeting grounds where the Grand Council convened. Ilara watched from her window until the last rider disappeared into the forest, then settled in to wait. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. She tried to read, tried to embroider, tried to focus on anything but the growing knot of dread in her stomach. Something felt wrong. The very air seemed to hum with malevolent energy. It was Sarah who came to her as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, her usually bright face pale with concern. "My lady, cook is asking about dinner. Should we prepare something special for His Majesty's return?" "Yes," Ilara said, grateful for the distraction. "Something simple. He'll be tired from the council session." "Of course, my lady. Perhaps some of that honey bread he's grown so fond of." Sarah's smile seemed forced, but Ilara attributed it to the tension that had gripped the entire castle. "That would be perfect. Thank you, Sarah." The young woman curtsied and left, but something about her manner nagged at Ilara. Sarah had been nothing but kind since her arrival, but there had been something different in her eyes just now, something that looked almost like pity. Before Ilara could examine the thought further, drowsiness began to creep over her. Strange. She'd slept well the night before, and fear should have kept her alert. But her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and the room seemed to blur around the edges. The tea. Sarah had brought her tea with the dinner inquiry, and she'd drunk it without thinking. Drugged. Ilara tried to stand, tried to call for help, but her limbs wouldn't obey her commands. The world tilted sideways as consciousness slipped away, her last thought a desperate prayer that Kieran would forgive her for being so foolish. She woke to the sound of hundreds of voices, the acrid smell of torchlight, and the cold bite of iron shackles around her wrists. The Grand Council's amphitheatre stretched around her like the maw of some ancient beast, tier upon tier of stone seats filled with the most powerful alphas in the 7 realms. At the centre of it all, she knelt on a platform that put her on display for every eye, every whispered judgment. Kieran stood 20 feet away, his face a mask of controlled fury that made the air itself seem to crackle with tension. Their eyes met across the space, and she saw her own terror reflected in his golden gaze. "Behold!" called a voice from the shadows, rich and mocking. The great Alpha King's weakness made manifest. A figure emerged from behind the council's high seats, tall and elegant with silver hair and eyes like winter ice. He wore robes of deepest black marked with symbols that made Ilara's skin crawl just looking at them. "Lord Malachi," Kieran's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "I should have known the Shadow Court's stench would lead back to you." "Such harsh words for an old friend," Malachi replied, with cold amusement. "We were brothers once, you and I, before you decided that sentiment was more important than strength. You were banished for good reason. Your methods? My methods preserved the old ways, the proper ways." Malachi's gaze shifted to Ilara, and she shuddered at the malice she saw there. Unlike this travesty, the great Kieran Darkwood, brought low by a servant's bastard. "Careful," Kieran warned, and power began to bleed into his voice. "Your words are walking very close to your death." "My death?" Malachi laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "I think not, old friend. Not when I hold what you value most." He gestured toward Ilara with theatrical flourish. "One word from me, and your precious little mate becomes just another casualty of war." The crowd murmured, some in shock, others in anticipation. Ilara could feel their eyes on her, judging, weighing, finding her wanting. She was everything they'd whispered about, common, weak, unworthy of their legendary king. "What do you want, Malachi?" Kieran's voice was deadly calm, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. "What I've always wanted, what we all want." Malachi spread his arms wide, addressing the assembled council. A return to strength. A king who rules with power rather than sentiment. A kingdom that doesn't bow to the weakness of mortal emotion. "And you think taking my mate will accomplish that? I think it will remind you what you truly are." Malachi's smile was cold as winter death. "You have a choice, Kieran Darkwood. Renounce this pretender publicly, before every alpha in the 7 realms, and she lives. Continue this charade of love and loyalty, and watch her die for your foolishness." The amphitheatre fell silent except for the crackling of torches. Ilara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on her. "You're asking me to choose between my mate and my crown," Kieran said finally. "I'm offering you the chance to remember who you were before she weakened you." Malachi moved closer to Ilara, close enough that she could smell the corruption that clung to him like perfume. The Kieran Darkwood I knew would never have let sentiment cloud his judgment. He would never have risked everything for one insignificant girl. "You're right," Kieran said quietly. "The man I was before would never have made that choice." Something cold and terrible unfolded in Ilara's chest. Of course, what had she expected? He was the Alpha King, ruler of 7 realms. She was nobody, nothing, a bastard servant's daughter who brought him nothing but trouble. But then Kieran's eyes met hers across the distance, and what she saw there took her breath away. Not apology or regret, but blazing absolute certainty. "The man I was before," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheatre, "was half alive, hollow, existing without purpose beyond duty and crown." He took a step forward, and the power radiating from him made several council members lean back in their seats. "The woman you call insignificant gave me back my soul. She made me whole. She turned survival into living, duty into joy, existence into life worth having." Another step, and now alphas were beginning to shift uneasily. "You want to know what I choose?" Malachi's confident smile faltered slightly. "Kieran, I choose her." The words rang out like a battle cry. "I choose love over fear, hope over despair, life over the empty throne you're offering me." Power exploded outward from him in waves that made the ancient stones tremble. "And I choose to remind you all why threatening what's mine is the last mistake you'll ever make." "She dies, you all die," Ilara whispered, remembering his words from the execution platform. "She dies," Kieran said, his voice carrying supernatural force that made every wolf in the amphitheatre bare their throats in submission. "You all die." Malachi stumbled backward, his face white with terror as he finally understood what he'd unleashed. "Kieran, wait." But the Alpha King was past waiting, past mercy, past anything but the primal need to destroy the threat to his mate. The air around him shimmered with lethal intent as he stalked toward Malachi like death-given form. "You wanted to see strength?" Kieran's smile was terrible to behold. "You wanted to remind me what I am. Allow me to demonstrate." What happened next was too swift for mortal eyes to follow. One moment Malachi was backing away, arms raised in futile defence. The next he was gone, reduced to nothing but shadow and dust. The Shadow Court conspirators who'd helped orchestrate the trap tried to run. They made it 3 steps before Kieran's power caught them, ending their existence with the same brutal efficiency. Silence fell over the amphitheatre like a burial shroud. Every alpha, every council member, every witness sat frozen as they processed what they'd just seen. Their legendary king, demonstrating exactly why legends were told about him. Kieran turned back to Ilara, his terrible fury melting away the moment his eyes found hers. He crossed the distance between them in swift strides, kneeling to break her chains with his bare hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm so sorry they got to you. I should have protected you better." "You came for me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You chose me." "Always." He pulled her against his chest, holding her like she was the most precious thing in all the 7 realms. "Forever. No matter what they offer me, no matter what they threaten, I will always choose you." Standing slowly, he helped her to her feet, then turned to face the stunned council. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. "Let this serve as notice to any who would challenge what's mine. Ilara is my mate, my queen, my equal in all things. Any who threaten her threaten me. Any who harm her sign their own death warrant." His arm tightened around her waist. "The Shadow Court is ended. Their rebellion is finished. And anyone foolish enough to follow their example will discover that there are fates worse than death." A council elder rose shakily to his feet. "Your Majesty, we had no knowledge of Lord Malachi's plans. The Shadow Court acted without our consent." "I know," Kieran replied, his tone gentling slightly. "Which is why you still draw breath." He looked around the amphitheatre, meeting every eye. "But understand this, my mate is not a weakness to be exploited. She is my strength made manifest, and I will burn the world to ash before I let anyone take her from me." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Whatever doubts they might have harboured about their king's choice had been thoroughly dispelled by his demonstration of power. "Come," Kieran murmured to Ilara, his lips brushing her temple. "Let's go home." Home, yes, wherever he was, that's where home would be. As they walked from the amphitheatre together, Ilara heard the whispers beginning behind them. Not mockery or doubt this time, but awe, wonder, the kind of reverent speculation reserved for legends in the making. The Alpha King and his mate. the love that had ended a rebellion and reshaped the balance of power in 7 realms, the bond that had proven stronger than crowns, more precious than kingdoms, and more deadly than armies when threatened. She leaned against Kieran's strength and smiled, finally understanding what it meant to be claimed by a king. The weeks that followed were a strange rhythm of healing and discovery. The Shadow Court's defeat had sent ripples of change throughout the 7 realms, and with them came a parade of nobles seeking audience with their Alpha King and his newly acknowledged queen. Ilara found herself transformed in ways she'd never imagined possible. Gone were the simple dresses and borrowed clothes of her past life. Now she wore gowns of midnight silk and deep emerald velvet, crowns of silver and moonstone that caught the light like captured starfire. But the most profound change was in how she carried herself. Spine straight, chin lifted, eyes bright with newfound confidence. "You're staring again," she said, without looking up from the trade agreement she was reviewing. Kieran had insisted she learn the intricacies of ruling alongside him, and to everyone's surprise, including her own, she'd proven gifted at it. "I'm admiring," he corrected, leaning back in his chair across from her in their shared study. "There's a difference." She glanced up with a smile that still made his breath catch. "Is there? Enlighten me, your Majesty." "Staring implies I'll eventually look away." His golden eyes held hers with that steady intensity that had become as familiar as breathing. "I have no intention of doing that." The easy banter between them had developed naturally over the weeks, replacing the careful courtesy of their early courtship with something deeper. Comfortable. Real. A knock at the door interrupted their comfortable silence. Marcus entered at Kieran's command, carrying a sealed message that made both rulers sit straighter. "From Ravenshollow, your Majesty," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "Lord Aldrich and Lady Vivian request an audience." Ilara's hand tightened on her quill. Her step-family. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "What do you want to do?" Kieran asked quietly, his voice gentle with understanding. "See them," she said, after a long moment. "I need to see them." "Together?" "Together." They received the delegation in the throne room, that vast chamber where Kieran held formal court. Ilara sat in the Queen's throne beside his, a chair that had been empty for 3 centuries until her arrival. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the trembling family who approached the dais with barely concealed terror. Lord Aldrich looked older than she remembered, his face gaunt and his clothes showing signs of reduced circumstances. Lady Vivian's famous beauty had been dimmed by worry lines and sleepless nights. Morgana, once so proud and cruel, could barely lift her eyes from the floor. They knelt at the base of the dais, and Ilara felt a strange detachment watching them. These people had controlled her entire life, made her feel worthless and unwanted, nearly caused her death. Now they trembled before the power she'd found, not through birth or bloodline, but through love. "Your Majesties," Lord Aldrich's voice cracked like autumn leaves, "we come to offer our humblest apologies for the grievous wrongs committed against Queen Ilara. We throw ourselves upon your mercy and beg forgiveness for our crimes." "Grievous wrongs," Kieran repeated, his voice carrying just enough edge to make them flinch. "Is that what we're calling attempted murder now?" "Your Majesty, please," Lady Vivian spoke up, tears streaming down her face. "We were desperate. The debts, the threats from our creditors. We weren't thinking clearly. We never meant for it to go so far." "You framed an innocent girl for treason," Kieran continued relentlessly. "You watched her walk to an execution block. You were prepared to let her die for your convenience." "We were wrong," Morgana whispered, finally lifting her tear-stained face. "We were so terribly wrong. Ilara, please, I know we don't deserve forgiveness, but—" "You're right," Ilara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the throne room. "You don't deserve forgiveness." The 3 family members went white, clearly expecting the death sentence their actions had earned. But, Ilara continued, rising from her throne with fluid grace, I'm going to give it to you anyway. Their gasps of shocked relief echoed through the chamber. Kieran's hand found hers as she stepped forward, his touch warm and reassuring. Not because you've earned it, she said, looking down at them with eyes that held wisdom hard-won through suffering, but because I refuse to let your hatred poison my happiness. I forgive you because holding on to that anger would diminish the joy I've found, and nothing you did to me is worth that cost. Ilara, Lady Vivian sobbed, thank you so much. I'm not finished. Ilara's voice hardened slightly. Your titles and lands are forfeit. Your debts are your own to settle. You'll leave the 7 realms and never return. The mercy I'm granting you is your lives and nothing more. We understand, Lord Aldrich said quickly. We're grateful for even that much. See that you remember it, Kieran added, his tone making it clear this was the only mercy they would receive. If any of you ever threaten my queen again, in any way, I will finish what that executioner's axe started. After they were gone, escorted by guards who would ensure they reached the borders safely, Ilara stood at the great window overlooking the valley. The autumn had deepened into winter while she'd been learning to be a queen, and snow now dusted the mountain peaks like sugar on dark cake. Any regrets? Kieran asked, joining her at the window. About banishing them? No. She leaned against his warmth, marvelling again at how perfectly she fit against his side. About forgiving them? Definitely not. They can't hurt me any more, and holding on to that hatred would only hurt me. You've grown wise, my queen. I've grown loved, she corrected, turning to face him. There's a difference. Is there? Enlighten me. She laughed at his echo of her earlier words. Wisdom comes from experience and learning. Love comes from being treasured so completely that you finally understand your own worth. Then I'm glad to have been part of your education. Part of it? She rose on her toes to brush a kiss across his jaw. You are my education. Every day you show me what it means to be cherished, protected, valued. Every day you prove that I deserve the love you give me. You deserve so much more than I could ever give you, he said seriously. You deserve everything. I have everything. Her smile was radiant with certainty. I have you. Before he could respond, she pulled back with a mischievous look that made his eyes narrow suspiciously. What are you planning? He asked. Nothing terrible, but I may have asked the seamstresses to prepare something special for tonight's dinner. Special how? You'll see. That evening, Kieran discovered what she meant when she appeared in the private dining room, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that matched the colour he'd been wearing the day he saved her life. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves fitted to her arms like water and around her throat. Is that new? He asked, his voice slightly hoarse. She touched the delicate silver chain that held a pendant in the shape of a wolf, its eyes set with tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight. A gift from my mate. Do you like it? I like seeing my mark on you, he said honestly, crossing to pull out her chair. I like everyone knowing you're mine. Just as much as I like everyone knowing you're mine, she agreed, settling into her seat with a grace that still amazed him. The meal was perfect. Roasted duck with winter vegetables, fresh bread with honey butter, wine that tasted like liquid starlight. But the company was better. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams for their future, plans for the kingdom, hopes for the children they both wanted to fill the castle's empty halls. What would you have done, Ilara asked as they shared a dessert of winter berries and cream, if the Shadow Court had succeeded? If they'd killed me before you could stop them? Kieran's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You don't want to know the answer to that question. I do, actually. I want to understand what I mean to you. You mean everything, he said simply. If they'd succeeded, there wouldn't have been a stone left standing in any of the 7 realms. I would have torn the world apart looking for something, anything, that could bring you back to me. And when I finally accepted that nothing could, I would have followed you into whatever comes after this life." The quiet certainty in his voice sent shivers down her spine. "That's terrifying." "That's love," he corrected. "At least that's what love means to me. You're not just my mate, Ilara. You're my everything. My reason for existing, my hope for the future, my peace in the storm. Without you, I'm just a man with a crown and nothing worth ruling for." "Kieran," she reached across the table to take his hand, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if something ever happens to me, really happens, not shadow court plots but actual death. Promise me you won't destroy yourself with grief. Promise me you'll live, you'll rule, you'll find some way to be happy again." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles. "I can't promise that." "Then I'll make you a deal." She squeezed his fingers. "I promise to live as long as possible, to be careful, to never leave you by choice, and you promise to try. If the worst happens, you promise to try to go on. For you, for both of us, for the love we have now, for the children we'll have, for the kingdom that needs its king." "I'll try," he said finally, "but only because you asked me to. Only for you. Only for me is enough." Later that night, as they sat by the fire in their chambers now, not his or hers, but theirs together, Ilara curled against his side and thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "The execution?" "Every day." His arm tightened around her. "It was the most terrifying and most important moment of my life. Terrifying because I almost lost you before I found you. Important because it was the beginning of everything that matters. I used to have nightmares about it, about the axe falling, about you not coming in time. And now? Now I dream about our future, about the children we'll have, the kingdom we'll build together, the love that will grow stronger every year." She tilted her head to look at him. "I dream about growing old with you, if such a thing is possible for immortal wolves." "It's possible," he said with quiet certainty. "When you choose to stop fighting time, when you decide you've lived enough lifetimes with your mate, the years catch up with you. We'll age together when we're ready. We'll choose our time." "Good." She smiled and settled back against his chest. "I want to choose everything with you. Every day, every decision, every moment of joy and challenge that comes. Even if I'm difficult? Especially then. Someone has to keep you humble, Your Majesty." His laughter rumbled through his chest, warming her more than the fire ever could. Outside their windows, snow began to fall, dusting the world in pristine white. Inside their sanctuary, love burned bright and constant, a flame that would never dim. They had faced death together and chosen life. They had weathered betrayal and chosen trust. They had confronted their deepest fears and chosen love. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. King and queen, alpha and mate, two souls made whole by the bond that connected them, forever. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Kieran and Ilara's journey in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of fated mates and second chances, please subscribe. It's free and it helps more people discover these tales of love conquering all.